And welcome back to the campus of Pepperdine University in Malibu, California. I'm Pete Peterson, the very grateful dean of Pepperdine University's Graduate School of Public Policy. And it's great to have you back for the next edition of Office Hours with Victor Davis Hanson. Each one of these sessions, we reflect back on the class Dr. Hanson has just taught. And so with that, let's welcome back our Giles-O'Malley Distinguished Visiting Professor, Dr. Victor Davis Hanson.
Thank you.
Great to have you.
Thank you.
So we are wrapping up the fall semester here on campus, and I know that you've just taught your last class yesterday.
Yes.
One of the classes that you've taught recently for which there was an assigned reading was on the Holocaust.
Yes.
This is part of a larger class that you are teaching on leadership decisions and leadership skills as manifest in World War II. And sometimes, Victor, when I get asked, as when they hear that I'm a dean of a policy school, they ask me, well, what is public policy? And to the degree they understand it, they think it's not really that detailed or important. But I think it's fair to say we're about to examine here the most evil public policy in human history, and that being the Holocaust.
Yes.
And with that, I think there still are a lot of questions about where it started, how it was carried out. There were a number of executive decisions and then implementary executive decisions made that carried out this most evil of public policies. One of the books you assigned for the class is Ian Kershaw's Fateful Choices, and I wanted to read, just to kick off our conversation, one of the comments that Dr. Kershaw makes in describing the Holocaust, and get your thoughts. Of all the fateful decisions we have considered in preceding chapters, the decision to kill the Jews, unfolding over the summer and autumn of 1941, is the one where it is least possible to conceive of alternatives. Had the invasion of the Soviet Union proceeded as the German leadership hoped it would, the final solution, known to history, would not have taken that particular form. The killing fields would, in all probability, then have been mainly in the Soviet Union and not in Poland. But as long as the Nazi regime was in power and engaged in the war, the Jews would have perished in one way or another. The decision to kill the Jews arose from an earlier aim, absolutely intrinsic to Nazism, to remove them. Hitler had never lost sight of this aim since 1919.
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about the intrinsic nature, that the Holocaust wasn't just a separate policy, but really intrinsic to the Nazi war aims.
Well, there's two questions. There's, as you say, where did the concept arise from, and how was it reified or actualized? And that's the second question involves World War II. But Europe in general, after the diaspora of the Jews, had a long history of anti-Semitism, mainly from the idea that Jesus was killed by a Jew and the Jews were not converted to Christianity. And the fact that in the Middle Ages and during, even all the way into the Renaissance and Enlightenment, Jews were barred from having property. And when you had the Industrial Revolution and the monetization of the economies, of modern economies, people who were not part of the landed aristocracy for years had mastered the fiscal processes in a sophisticated economy. So what I'm getting at, in most of the European countries, the Jewish population that had been discriminated against had a long history of surviving without the traditional hallmarks of land or small business. In other words, they were adept at stocks, insurance, and they became very wealthy in the 19th century, and that spurred this ancient anti-Semitism even further. Hitler in Mein Kampf talks about walking down the Strasse in Austria and seeing these big Jewish homes, and Jews were overrepresented in law, medicine, and finance, and that created, especially after World War I, even though Jews had been very prominent in the Central Powers armies. One of the tragedies of tragic ironies of the Holocaust was Jews going to the gas chambers and showing their iron crosses for bravery in World War I. But Germany had actually been no more anti-Semitic, let's say, than Poland had been. It was primarily more acceptable the more east you went. And part of that was because the sophisticated and wealthier economies, and they tended to be a little bit more democratic in the West. There were fewer Jews, and the Jews that were there were more assimilated and intermarried. And so when Hitler took power in 1933 and they started this series of Jewish exclusionary laws, they had a lot more practical problems. And that is, the population was more acculturated with Jews, and they weren't identifiable by their clothing or their beards, and as they were in the East, and they didn't necessarily speak Yiddish. They were fully assimilated. So Hitler had a problem of blaming the Jews for World War I. You see, because the German army surrendered while it was in Belgium and France. That was one of the big mistakes the Allies made, because they did not go into Germany and occupy it as they did in World War II. And so the stab in the back was immediately promulgated by German nationalists as early as 1919 after the Versailles Treaty. And they had to come up with a excuse that German army was beaten. They would have collapsed in another month, probably by December of 1918. But that blood libel arose that we were winning because we were in France. No foreign army ever occupied Germany, but the Jews and the communists, which were inseparable, stabbed us in the back. And that was one of the themes. And then Hitler said, but Hitler didn't create this idea. It went back all the way back to Oswald Spengler and early 19th century German philosophers and political activists. And you can see it in Alfred Rosenberg, the Nazi ideologue who tried to formulate these ideas formally for Hitler, that Germany had been a blood and soil country, that when the Roman Empire was formed, Romans were not able to go across the Danube or the Rhine. So they were a pure race. But that purity that they had established by being separate from Rome and the Mongolization, they said, of peoples under the Roman Empire. And Hitler mentioned that, and people said the Roman emperors weren't even Italian by the 2nd century. He thought that he had to preserve that after World War I, especially because he felt that Jews that were not traditional Germans, and Gypsies were another group, Eastern Europeans had come into Germany, and he wanted to exclude them and reestablish this romantic, it's in Germans that are described in Tacitus's Germania or Wagner's operas. But at this early point, it was mostly a jealousy and an anger.
Yeah.
And the idea that Germany had 70 million people in World War I, and it had defeated the Soviet Union in February of 1918, and yet it could not then do the easier task of winning the Western Front when it only had a one-front war. And so this whole mythology that the Jews were to blame, and that next time we did it, we're going to purify the Jews from Western Europe, and we're going to go into the East where most of the Jews of the, there were probably 12 million European Jews, another 6 million around the world, but the majority of that population was east of the Rhine, and especially in two places, the Ukraine and Poland probably accounted for 4 million of the 6 million that were killed.
I want to get to that part of the Holocaust and the process leading up to it, which was the decision by Hitler, which we talked about last time, about his decision to go east and attack the Soviet Union. But I do want to get into this element here of, first, the broader anti-Semitism that was already present in Europe, not just in Germany, but especially tying, as you have done, the anti-Semitism in Germany, and particularly from Hitler, again, going back to Kershaw's quote that this didn't begin in 1933. For Hitler, this began in 1919 in the wake of World War I. Just another quote here from Kershaw. Jews were a tiny minority of the German population, a mere 0.76% in 1933, and self-evidently in no position to challenge for power in the state, make competing claims on territory or scarce resources, or pose any other than phantasmic fashion the sort of perceived threat which served as the pretext for a number of instances of, quote, ethnic cleansing in the 20th century. The Nazi image of the Jew went way beyond conventional hatreds. It presupposed the Jew as nothing less than the supreme existential danger.
Yeah. Hitler, although they tolerated Christianity and they tried to warp their vision to coincide with Nazi ideology, unlike earlier anti-Semitism, the primary catalyst wasn't the old libel that the Jews had killed Jesus and had fought Christians. It was more of an idea that there were blonde-haired, blue-eyed, not Hitler, of course, but this Aryan ideal and the physical, mental excellence of this race was not being manifested as far as titles, positions, monetary compensation. In other words, there was a group of people in Germany, as I said, in the professions and in finance, but especially in avant-garde areas that Hitler was very sensitive to as a failed artist. So he was very, very angry at Impressionist, but especially representational and modern art. He said this was created by the Jews. He didn't get into the Austrian Art Academy, because he was a mediocre draftsman, but this was a period when you were having abstract art. It wasn't dominated by Jews, but he felt it was, or he said it was. This was a period when Freud was talking about the Oedipus and the Electra complex. So he, in his way, new fields like sexuality and repression were all coming out of a Jungian, Freudian perversion. And he also felt that art, literature, he talked about literature a lot, this was all corrupted by a foreign influence that had weakened Germany and was in part attributable to both the defeat in World War I, but more importantly, the failure, he thought, of the Weimar Republic that was decadent. The cabaret culture, he said, was part of this Jewish contagion, as he called it. He almost used medical terms, that this had been an infection among the German people. And then when he talked in Mein Kampf about a purified race that was going to occupy the East, he delineated people who did not qualify. And there were gypsies, some Eastern Europeans, and even Germans that had things like multiple sclerosis or muscular dystrophy or autism or cognitive defects. And they killed about 75,000 of them. But always the Jews were the number one people. Homosexuals, communists later. So that was what he promised to do. But the first year of the war, 1939, he went into Poland, and it started almost immediately. There was no provocation. They killed 70,000 Poles in the first 3 or 4 weeks, usually by shooting them or blowing them up or something, or getting Einsatzgruppen. And these were local anti-Semites. The Nazis would go in and say, look, we know there's 50 Jewish families in your neighborhood. They got these beautiful homes, cars, money. Bring them out and shoot them, and we'll split their good. The Reichsmark, it was a money-making operation. They made billions of marks by confiscation of Jewish fortunes. But the point was they were very careful to deny this. They had done that in the 36 Olympics. They said, no, we don't do this. They said, we treat Jews very well. And so they were afraid that they would bring in the United States or they would bring in Britain as active participants while they were going to deal with Russia. They wanted a one-front war with. But after the fall of France, they felt they had a buffer now, and it would be very hard for the remaining allies, the United States and Britain, to learn what was going on. So after 1940, you started to see strict enforcement of the Yellow Star, and the exclusionary laws now started to morph into random killing. And Kristallnacht, they had killed, about 95 or 100 people. But with the absorption of France, they felt that now they had sort of a soundproof barrier and they could start in earnest. And they started to round up people in Western Europe. But there was not, again, there was only about 500,000 Jews out of 80 million in Germany, and probably no more than 1 million in all of Western Europe. And half of those millions survived, either through hiding through sympathetic people like in Denmark, or they were intermarried and they couldn't quite figure out their genealogy. So when he went into Eastern Europe, then that became not the overriding reason. Lebensraum was that he wanted room for Germans, and he was going to kill mostly Slavs and Russians. And he killed 6 million civilians in the first 3 years that were non-Jewish, Poles and Russian prisoners. But once he got in there and the fortunes of war began to turn on him, he started to rationalize his boneheaded strategic decisions by saying these were where I had to get my hands on the Jews. So the real killing period for places like Treblinka and Auschwitz, it started, the Wannsee Conference was January of 41, beautiful area and lake outside Berlin. And that was where the decision was made. But the mechanics of the railroads and the introduction of Zyklon B gas or carbon monoxide in camps, that started in late 41 and 42. And the real high point, the worst part, was probably July of 42 all the way to early January 42. That's where 4 million of the 6 million were killed.
Let's go to that that part of the discussion about how these decisions were made. Again, to understand the Holocaust as not only a horrific and evil part of human history, but to see it as a real public policy, an example of that and how it was carried out. I wanted to get to this quote from Kershaw and get your thoughts on it, because it gets to how human beings make decisions like this and carry them out. This is Kershaw. In another way, too, the decision to kill the Jews was unique among those we have examined. It was no conventional decision, such as to go to war or not, taken after confidential discussions with a small number of ministers, generals, or other associates, but then proclaimed publicly. It was a state secret of the highest order, not to be talked about, even by the initiated. The most incriminating orders were given orally. Camouflage language was used in discussions at the highest level. Hitler himself never spoke directly of killing the Jews, even in his innermost circle. So talk a bit about this term that began to be used about the final solution and what that meant.
Well, they used two euphemisms. One was the Jewish question, and one was the final solution. And there were about 250,000 Germans involved in the direct mechanics of the Holocaust. And by that I mean rounding them up and then transporting them to the death camps. And remember, even Dachau was not a death camp, it was a concentration. It became a death camp, but compared to Treblinka or Belsen, but especially Auschwitz, it didn't kill the majority of Jews there. They were very careful. They were very afraid of German public opinion, especially as the war got worse for them. And there was a lot of anger among the German population. They were getting bombed, they were blaming Hitler. And they did not want to tell the German people that they were slaughtering Jews, many of whom had lived for centuries in Germany, were intermarried. So they used these euphemisms, they denied it. Even when people had escaped, say, from Auschwitz and got west, and the United States and the BBC were broadcasting it, the German people couldn't believe it. They knew it. They knew something was going on, but they were told that the Jews were going to work. And in fact, they did use about 1.5 million Jews were worked, many of them to death. But when the war was over, there was probably 700,000 Jews in Germany alone that were in work camps. So the Germans said, well, I see Jews working all the time. They're not treated very well, but that proves that we're not killed. They wanted not to believe the truth. So it was, how it was persuasive, how they persuaded people to participate in it was interesting, because they used 7 or 8 different levers. Once they got east, they understood that anti-Semitism was much more pronounced in Eastern Europe and Western Russia than it had been in Western Europe, partly because Jews were much more identifiable. They were more segregated, there were ghettos, and they were more identifiable, and they were more devout. There were a lot of secularized Jews that had fully assimilated. So the idea of the yellow star didn't come up to be used in Eastern Europe. It was the idea that, and they discussed this, they said, well, wait a minute, if we can't tell who Jews are, how can they be inferior if they look like Germans, and we have to put a star on them? That's kind of a prima facie admitting that they're indistinguishable. But in Eastern Europe, we can see that because they're identifiable. So that being said, they understood that people in Lithuania and Ukraine and places like that would help, especially that they did not like Jews, they were jealous of them. They used the Christian card. They said to Christian communities, the old blood libels, Jews drank the blood of Christian babies, they killed Jesus. They used the financial angle. They said, we'll split the money with them. They had a lot of help from Swiss bankers to launder the money through Switzerland. And then they used the military angle that even if we lose, Hitler said, they will at least look back 100 years from now and say, my decision to go east cleared Jews from Europe. And even people who were not born, who encountered Jews, will thank me that there's not very many Jews left. And then, of course, in addition to that, they were almost telling the Allies, and they were very happy that Jews had gone to the United States and been turned around. They were worried, they had known that. By 43, we were not admitting Jews, and a lot of people did not want them. So Hitler and Radio Berlin were saying, they criticize us for our treatment of Jews, and we let Jews go in 41 and 42, and the Allies didn't take them, and the Russians don't want them, and the British don't want them. It was kind of an exaggeration, because we took over 100,000 Jews in the United States, even though Roosevelt's State Department was anti-Semitic to the core. But the argument he was using is, everybody doesn't want Jews, I'm taking care of the Jews. 100 years from now, you'll gain the wisdom to see what I did. And so they tried to appeal to almost, they had people in the Christian ministries, and they were saying, you've had a millennia of arguments and rivalries with Orthodox Jews, we're solving the problem with you. They went to local business people, and they went to the army, and they said, the money is, we're making billions of marks, and this is, they always said Auschwitz paid for itself and made a profit. Because even though we had already confiscated the Jewish money, when they came to Auschwitz, Jews hid in their person diamonds, gold, so they could survive by giving gifts to guards or trying to survive one war. Just the confiscation from the people in the rail cars paid for Auschwitz. And they did this because people in the army were not all anti-Semitic. They were old Prussian officers. And they had commanded Jews, or they had Jewish officers in World War I. And they were saying things like, we're out of supplies in Army Group Center, and you're using 25% of the rail cars for whatever that you're doing. We don't quite know what you're doing, but you're putting Jews on them, and we either need them to work to make weapons, or we need to stop that because we need to put food and soldiers and parts on it. So
let's drill down on that for a second. Just this evil ideology, this anti-Semitism that obviously drove Hitler and drove the Third Reich, it was actually counterproductive to the broader German war aims. And I think what a lot of people may not understand is just, and certainly Kershaw talks about it and uses the word intrinsic, how much the Holocaust was actually intrinsic to the entire Nazi war aim.
The Nazis said they profited because they confiscated Jewish personal property, but it was almost a redistribution. They didn't create any new wealth, it preyed on wealth. And what I mean by preyed on wealth, it took 6 million people out of the labor force. And more importantly, if you look at key munitions program, like the atomic bomb, he called physics Jewish physics. So about 30% of the people that were working in New Mexico had come from occupied Europe and were Jewish. And the architect, or the guy that wrote the famous letter to Roosevelt, was Albert Einstein, who was ridiculed in Germany as a Jewish physicist. They didn't believe physics was actually a legitimate topic of science because Jews had created it, they said. So when you take their professors were all barred from the university. And maybe during the war you could say, well, that didn't hurt the war effort in terms of literature and art and music, because they wiped out all of the best musicians, the artists, but they started to take people out of the medical schools, and they started taking people out of the law schools, and they started taking people out of the engineering schools. And it really hurt them, because when you look at German science in World War I, it was comparable to Allied science. But by World War II, by 1943 and 4, you could argue that although the Germans had V-1 rockets or jet engines, the Allies were pretty close, but on every other aspect, from radar to sonar to the atomic bomb to 4-engine bombers, the Allies were not only ahead of them in science, but they were much more adept at creating products from that science, practical and pragmatic applications, because they had just decapitated the 1% or the 2% that were stellar in all of these occupations that would have been central to the war. And he always, then one other lever was when people said, you're going east, mein Führer, you should not go into Russia. He was told that by most of the apparat of the Nazi, the Wehrmacht. And he said, the Jews are querulous. I warned them, I said that if we have another war, it'll be the end of Jewry. So when he went east, coinciding with Pearl Harbor a few months later, he said to everybody in the Nazi Party, and they repeated it in the airways, the Führer has said the Jews are going to suffer because their argumentation, their querulousness, they're always getting in people's business. This is manifested on a national and global, and that's why we are going into, we're fighting with the Russians, we're fighting with but behind every argument that Germany has with America, Britain, Russia, there's a Jew. And they started it, not me. That was the propaganda that he promulgated.
Let's go into that and shift now to the connection between the Holocaust and, as you say, Hitler's decision to go east, which again, many of his own generals and advisors said you should not do that. Obviously, it ended up being an utter dead end for him with Operation Barbarossa. But let's just tie the two things together about this decision to go east into the Soviet Union and the Holocaust. This again is Kershaw. By the time German troops crossed the Soviet frontiers on 22 June 1941, then Hitler's regime had already moved a long way in a genocidal direction. The momentum had built up sharply during the period of nearly 2 years since Poland had been crushed. The numbers of Jews who had fallen under Nazi rule with the conquest of Poland, the barbarous treatment of the subjugated country, in which Jews were its lowest, most despised stratum, and the impossibility of finding a solution to an invented problem, however grandiose the vistas and however brutal the methods, all forced the ever more frantic search for a way out of this impasse. Now, the alluring prospect of a final territorial solution where the Jews of Europe would die out in the Arctic wastes of the Soviet Union, interlocked with plans for an annihilatory war in which Jews, seen as the lifeblood of Bolshevism, lay in the path of the German army and were regarded as open season for the secret police.
I think what Kershaw is trying to say is that the death camps and the organophosphates, organochloride gases that they used to liquidate them was not the first choice. The first choice was, well, the Allies are very sensitive, they're going to find out what we're doing, so we're going to send all the Jews to Madagascar. And that was they investigated that, and then they found out that it was expensive. They didn't have a navy. The Jews would be interrupted in transit and freed by the Allies, who the two biggest navies in the world were.
And just to interject here, they're talking about these plans as they're fighting a war.
As they're fighting a war. And the people who are talking about it have more prestige than the people fighting the war. They're talking about Heydrich and Goering and Himmler. And Himmler has the Waffen-SS under his control, but a lot of their intention is on this topic. It was considered a prestigious post. And then they said, when we go into Russia, we can just put them on the railroads and use the Trans-Siberian Railroad across the Urals, and we'll just send millions of them, and they'll just starve to death in the vast expanse of the eastern part of Russia, the 2/3 of Russia beyond the Ural Mountain. Nobody will know what happened to them. They will die very easily. We don't even have to say we killed them. We just said, well, we gave them land to live on. That was the idea. And but then what's funny about, not funny, but revealing about it, I mean funny in the idea of tragically ironic, the worst Hitler started to fare in Eastern Europe when he didn't take Moscow and he didn't have access to Siberia. And you would think at this point he would give up on it. That was the period where the death camps came into being, and there were 16 or 17 of them, but for all practical purposes, Belsen, but especially Treblinka, about 1 million were killed there, and about 1 million, 1 or 2 at Auschwitz, Birkenau. That's when they started to really come into their productive capacity of killing people. The worse they started to fare, then Hitler said, you know what, I don't think we're going to be able to win this war, and we're not going to be able to put death camps in Russia because the Red Army might come and take them. So we're going to put them in occupied Poland. And the two countries that were most receptive of the conquered population, they felt, I'm not suggesting that the Poles didn't object to it, they did, but the two countries they felt would have less popular resistance, let's say, than a country like Denmark or the Czechs, who were pretty adamant, and even Italy, Mussolini wouldn't give Jews over to Hitler, were the Romanians and the Poles. And so that's where most of the European Jews were killed, in Poland and Romania, and some in Eastern Germany, but not very many in comparison of the 6 million that were gassed. And then there was probably, I shouldn't say 6 million were gassed, 3 million were gassed, 2 million were killed in the camps, maybe a million, and about 1 million to 1.5 million were shot and killed in the first 2 years of the war. These were when Army Group North went into the Baltic countries, they just started murdering Jews. When they went into Poland, they started murdering Jews. The Ukrainians, Baba Yar and the 30,000 that were killed there, and that kept going on. It wasn't just that one occasion where they opened pits and put people in and shot them. That went on to 100 to 150,000 until it was liberated by the Red Army. But the Ukrainians were mostly the people who occupied it. The Germans were very, I don't know what the word is, conniving, evil. They were very manipulative to tell local anti-Semites, we're here to help you, and you've always wanted to do this, and we're not going to put our fingerprints on it like you will. And they all came out of the woodwork, either because they felt that they were anti-Jewish because they were Catholic, or they wanted money through confiscations, or they thought that the Germany was going to win the war and they would get rewards and they would be advanced through the German-occupied bureaucracies, or they hated Jews because of their own sense of inferiority. Whatever the reason, they were able to get a lot of people to participate that weren't Germans in Occupy. But when it was all over, I mean, there were 18 million Jews in the world, and they killed 1/3 of them. And they didn't get their hands on the other third that was in Europe, and then there was a diaspora of another third.
But that was their plan.
That was
just
their
to
plan.
be clear.
That was their plan. They thought America was the country that had 3 to 4 million Jews, and that's what they said. We'll never be able to get our hands on Jews till we have a 4-engine bomber and get the Azores or a V-2 rocket, so maybe we can do it. They talked about it, that they thought Roosevelt was Jewish. And one of the things Hitler kept saying is the reason that we're losing the war is we stupidly exported the last century 20 million Germans. So all these American soldiers, the only ones that fight well are Germans, German Americans. They look like us, and they're run by Jews. Jews are controlling them. And how horrible this is that the American Jews, or Morgenthau and all these people in the Roosevelt administrations are unleashing our people against us. It was very racialized, that their whole concept of the war.
What I'd like to do, obviously, the subject of the Holocaust in many ways requires hours, if not years of discussion. We're told to never forget, and we must never forget. But I'd like to draw to a close this conversation and pull it back to the class that you're teaching here at the policy school, because one of the themes that we've touched on several times through the course of our office hour sessions is the connection that you often make between public policy leadership and morality. The fact that irony is at play, but there's also, these are not purely disinterested, rational in some ways decisions. And in that, the influence of ideology, obviously in this case, to generate and create conditions that were utterly evil, really bears understanding that intersection between ideology, leadership, and public policy.
I think we all think that leaders are better educated than we are, and they advance through the ranks to assume power based on their powers of reason and intellect, and there's no historical support for that. It's usually their ruthlessness or their understanding of human nature, both good and bad. The historian Thucydides said that Athens fought to keep its empire for 3 motivations that were common to all people, and it was kind of not Hitler-like, but it was very cynical when they have a Athenian diplomat say, well, we have an empire because we took it and we conquered people because we were afraid, fear, and it's the word deos, and then we did it because of self-interest,
Right.
Fear, self-interest, and pride or honor. And so never did he say calculated reason and self-interest in the sense of data-driven. So when you go and you say to Hitler, well, wait a minute, you have a Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and Hitler, is being supplied by Stalin maybe 30% of the essential food, ore, and fuels of the Third Reich that's already conquered all of what is now the EU. And we're talking now March, April, May of 1941. And you have Stalin, who's actively helping Hitler and has helped it. So people say to Hitler, why would you go in there? There's no rational reason. And one of the reasons he says is because that's where the Jews are. That's not the primary reason, but later it becomes one of the primary reasons. And it's like the Japanese when people were discussing what to do in 1941, the Japanese War Council says, well, we're going to hit the United States, or we can join the Germans in Russia. They have 3 choices, or we can, because there's no choice, we're going to make peace. How are we going to expand our self-interest and our honor, time, as the Greeks called it, and we can consolidate and expand our 2 million man army in China. And the arguments are kind of data-driven for Russia. Germany on December 7th is right outside Germany, Moscow. They are told that they're near the first subway station. And they think any day now, Russia, and they want to get in on the spoils from Vladivostok, which, it's only 200 or 300 miles across the ocean from Japan. So their idea is just leave the United States alone, one element. We'll go to Vladivostok, go from the east and clean up and cut it up with the Germans. The other faction says, well, there's all these orphan colonies, Dutch East Indies, French Indochina. Britain is surrounded, so Malaysia's orphan. The United States is, we can just take the Philippines. And they say, well, wait. There's the United States. If we don't destroy the fleet, and they'll still build another one because we don't have no ability. So only one person, Togo, said that. But the other, what I'm getting at is the other faction said, but we can go into China. And everybody thought 650 million people, and you've got 2 million. But they thought that Chinese were inferior people. Yeah. And they started to do, people forget that Hitler killed 6 million Jews, and he probably killed 10 million civilians, Russian prisoners, civilians in Russia. Japan killed 16 to 18 million Chinese. And although it wasn't a sophisticated approach to genocide, it was Nanking. You had Japanese officers with ice buckets because their hands got so swollen from shooting. And so it was a very irrational thing to do. Why would you go into this huge country and think you're going to take the entire country? Because you think that they're completely morally, intellectually inferior to the Yamamoto people, Yamamoto people, and that one Japanese soldier is better than 10 Chinese, and we're going to liquidate them, kill them, and take over Shanghai. And that's what they did. But so a lot of these decisions in World War II were built on people's fears, their sense of honor, their perceived self-interest, and their rational way they looked at the world. And in retrospect, and I was telling the students out the other day, it seems easy now, in retrospect, to look at decisions that seem irrational. But if you look at our decision, and I'm speaking as someone who supported dethroning Saddam Hussein, but I think never in anybody's right mind did you really think you were going to go in there and dethrone this horrific person who had killed 1 million Iraqis. Everybody wanted to do that, but then you were going to stay for 20 years and try to build a modern democracy in a very devout Muslim society that had no experience, and you were going to spend blood and treasure, and the American people are going to support that, or much less go into 20 years in Afghanistan, and while you're trying to win a war, you're flying the Prague flag from the embassy, and you're having a gender studies in a very traditional Islamic society. That seems completely irrational. But not if you think there was a lot of people who think the American culture, everybody loves us, we're going to spread democracy, they'll just flock to us. And so, or even on the border, you see this decision. Why, if you wanted to let people into the United States, why wouldn't you do it orderly and legally, and maybe make the case that you want 10 million people across the border? But the idea that you just simply destroy the border and you destroy federal immigration laws and you welcome in 12 million people, and then you say that the border is secure, it was almost Orwellian. And why would a sophisticated person do that? Because they had an irrational commitment to either the idea of no borders or a post-global world where the nation state was archaic, or they felt that the demography of the United States would be enriched by people who were more dependent on government and would need, whatever the reason was, it was to most people irrational. And so people think they will never do that. Last night when we were talking to a group of Pepperdine supporters who were talking about recent decisions, they said, well, why did they do that? Why? I disagree with it, but what was the reason? And I was trying to say there doesn't have to be a reason. I mean, there is a reason, ostensible reason, but people get emotional and they pick and choose rationalizations based on their own. I don't want to be too reductionist, but if Hitler had been a talented artist and he had gone to the Austrian Art Academy and had been accepted. And he could have very well had a Jewish professor. He knew Jews that he liked in World War I, and he had been a very successful artist. I don't think you would have had the Nazi Party zeal as it did, because he attracted the same type of people. Himmler, the chicken farmer. Goebbels, the failed academic, the linguist. Goering, the coke, obese, former has-been World War I hero. And he united them all in the idea that we are superior and we're going to destroy the Jews. And all of them, he said to them in this table talk, the Jews have done all these things. And they all thought the Jews had thwarted their own careers. And that's what's scary is you can see it today. You look at the Holocaust, and you see it, that same irrational hatred of Jews practiced in two realms. Abroad, especially in the case of Israel, people are always angry at the Jews because of the genocide. They'll always use the word, Israel's committing a Holocaust. Well, Israel is not killing 6 million people. They don't have trains. They don't have Zyklon B. It's a messy war, just like we did in Fallujah, just like everybody does, unfortunately. That's the way, just like the Arab countries fight with each other. But they deliberately use that word genocide and Holocaust to tag Jews, almost in anger that they feel, well, you people are the victims of all victims and will never be able to challenge your victimhood. And we want to be victims, so we're going to call you Holocaust people and genocide. And it's deliberately aimed to inflame Jews and strip that Holocaust from their collective memory. Say, you're no longer the children of the Holocaust because you're the perpetrators, you're the SS, you did this, and then you see here in the United States, when you ask yourself, why in the year 2023 and 24 are Jews being chased into the library at Cooper Union? Why at my university do 4 liberal professors on the left,
this is Stanford,
compile a 900-page dispassionate analysis of anti-Semitism and come to the conclusion that this small population of Jewish students are not safe at Stanford, and they are subject to continual ridicule and intimidation, and their mental health is impaired and their physical being is in danger. Same could be said of UCLA or USC. So how does that happen? And the reason it happens is we are saying to a group of people that your unhappiness or your failure or your unmet expectations, whether it's identifying with your ethnic group or your religion or your own personal circumstances, somewhere there's Israel and the Jews there. Because think about it for a second. We're talking about refugees. Refugees, the Jews did this, the Jews did this. And I'm thinking, well, the Turks occupy almost half of Cyprus, and they ethnically cleanse hundreds of thousands of Greeks. They killed probably 15 to 20,000. They're still in occupation. I have never seen a campus talk about that. Have you? Have you seen a demonstration for the Cypriot Greeks? And then you say, well, during the 48 war, the 56 war, the 67 war especially, there were 1 million Jews in Baghdad, in Damascus, in Cairo, in Amman, had lived there since the 9th century. And all of a sudden, they ethnically cleansed them. They were all said to get out. Most of them end up in Israel. I don't see any Jews saying, well, at the founding of the Israelis, there was a change of population, or there was this diaspora of Arabs and Jews, but we had 1 million Jews that were kicked out because we were Jewish, and we had to flee. Nobody ever says that. I've never seen anybody on a campus saying, I'm a Jew from Egypt and I was kicked out and I was a refugee and I'm a stateless person. And as Edward Said did, dangle my keys. Here's the keys to my home in Amman. And so one of the reasons that the college presidents were, when they were interrogated in Congress, the MIT, the Pennsylvania, the Harvard president, and they were asked about this question, why are you allowing this? They had no answers, because the only answer that was true was that we have large numbers of people on campus who will tolerate anti-Semitism, and we have a strong core of people on the left, not the right anymore, on the left, who are anti-Semites, and we can't stop it, and we don't get any pressure to stop it. If any of these groups that were chased into the library are accosted or pushed down or had their posts were black or Latino or gay, or we would have stopped it like that. But but Jewish students in Israel, no. So what I'm getting at is we see this as irrational and it can never happen again. But in our own lives, we're seeing just as many irrational things. And no one says anything. So you say, well, where were the German people to say, not in my name, are you going to send Jews to Auschwitz? Well, there were some, but not many. But where are the American people, the American faculty saying, we're not going to chase Jews out and put posters up or tear down or go into the president's office, or when Ben Shapiro comes to campus, put a raid can, said, Ben be gone, playing on the theme of Zyklon B on the Stanford campus. So could it happen again? Yes, it could happen again.
Well, and I think that really does bring us to a place to understand as well that I think uniquely at Pepperdine, we can talk about the moral dimension to all of these things. We can even talk about the word sin, which is never used in most policy schools or a lot of college campuses. But that evil is really grounded in the primary evil. That anti-Semitism in many ways is grounded in that first understanding of evil, which is to believe that one side is created by God and the other is not. And at the grounding of some clear understanding of allowing for pluralism is that founder's understanding of the country that we are all created by God and endowed with inalienable rights. And as soon as we deviate from that and make these categorical distinctions, and not only make those distinctions, but set it hierarchically, and maybe they would never put it in theological terms, but essentially what people are saying, and this is particularly true of the history of anti-Semitism, is that one side is created by God and the others are somehow less than human. In other words, they are not created by God. And that first distinction is the beginning of so much evil and certainly lies at the heart.
Well, that was certainly true of Hitler, because the first targets of his attack were the traditional Protestant and Catholic clergy in Germany. The original people had fought this for the most part, and they were either isolated or killed off or put in camps, and a second generation were allowed to conduct services. But we got to remember, he used the word Christianity and God, but in his private discourse and in Nazi ideology, they hated Christianity. Their idea was almost an old Wagnerian Norse mythology. Not quite, but that's what they were trying to create, if not just a secularism, a genetic. Their gods were geneticism, and they thought they were heaven on earth, or they were deities, and they could create the perfect human through breeding and racial exclusion. But when you don't have that moral hierarchy to say stop, then all sorts of opportunists of various degrees of hatred and prejudice start to come out of the woodwork. That was what was tragic. If I get back to the college presidents, they didn't understand that. They had PhDs, they had all of these titles, they had all of this compensation, but all they had to say was, I have to set the moral example at Harvard and Penn, and I have to make it clear, no matter how unpopular it is, no student will be shouted down and chased on my campus, and no student will try to intimidate and manhandle and get in the face of other people. No faculty will take students at Stanford and say, you go over here at my side of the classroom, this is the Jewish side of the classroom, you go over there, this is the good side. As soon as that happened, he should have been immediately fired and terminated. He was later put on leave, and students are still trying to bring him back at Stanford. There's a big movement to do that. But when you don't, I guess what I'm saying is human nature is like a volcano. It doesn't change. And religious leaders, university leaders, intellectuals, whatever term you use, they have their hand on the cone, and that's their job. But when they take it off, or when they use their breath as bellows to encourage it, things change very quickly, and people come out of the woodwork that are frightening, that are always there. And the modern notion that we're a therapeutic society and that because we give PhDs or JDs and we've got iPhones or we've got the Google, we've progressed morally at the same rate we have technologically defies all history. Because you can find so many passages, both in literature and actual fact in history, where moral, intellectual and material progress are accompanied by moral regress. And that's surely what happened in Germany.
Well, Victor, thanks so much for this semester, and thank you for your time with our students and helping to prepare more moral leaders.
Well, thank you. Appreciate it.